So here's something which I'm offering you as a little extra. It's beyond optional. I strongly encourage you not to watch this. I don't think it will help you at all. It will probably just add to your confusion. But when I was thinking about whether or not to do it, David B asked a question earlier in the live session, and I thought to myself, you know what, Steve, you've got to do the process dissociation. David says, it feels like it's almost impossible to isolate perception without having some conscious interference, and thus it seems hard to truly create a perfect experiment without basically having unconscious participants. And you'll see why that's relevant in a moment. But before we come to David's point, I want to go back to a problem that I mentioned before I concluded the section on awareness, the third topic in this course on mind and reality. So the problem was this. The way that scientists seem to operationalise perceptual awareness in the blindsight literature essentially involves subject reports. It's done quite carefully. So the brilliant scientists like Weizkrantz and colleagues, it's kind of an insult to say, wrongly I think, that they've somehow confused a biased measure with an unbiased measure. I don't think they've done that. I think they're very sophisticated in the way they use verbal reports, but they are using verbal reports to infer awareness. Whereas Dretske suggests in effect that that's not how we should operationalise perceptual awareness. Dretske's idea over here is that we can infer lack of awareness from information not being available to the subject as a reason. Now, what Dretske promised us, though, is that we'd go from scientific research back to operationalisation, and from there back to a claim about the functions. But Dretske's view doesn't align with the scientific research. It's now a question, well, why should we accept what Dretske said? So I was motivated to consider some further scientific research on perception without awareness. But here's where David B's observation comes in. I think this came out of discussion with Sam W. and a few other people earlier. So Debner and Jacobi point out, I think quite rightly, that we shouldn't expect conscious and non-conscious processes to dissociate cleanly. Every effect can be influenced by both. We shouldn't think then that there's going to be a case where somebody's perceiving but not perceptually aware, another case where perceptual awareness is doing all the work. Every case is going to involve elements of both. And if you think about it, this fits blindsight pretty well, actually. So what Weizkrantz and colleagues suggest is that blindsight isn't like another mode of vision. Either you've got sort of non-blindsight or you've got blindsight. No, what they suggest is this, that there are essentially multiple kinds of perceptual processes, and in blindsight, participants have a deficit to the kind of perceptual processes that underpin perceptual awareness, while some of the other perceptual processes are spared. But if you think about it in that way, you surely don't think that this is a kind of all or nothing thing. Blindsight, of course, results from damage to the brain, right? Typically some kind of injury, possibly some other kind of illness. That's not going to, as it were, cleanly wipe out the perceptual awareness, leaving everything else intact. Surely it's not. So I think, don't get me wrong here. I think this theoretical point is right. Nevertheless, people who have blindsight are clinically blind in part of their visual field. So the idea that, well, it's just all some kind of residual awareness, I'm not taking you there. I don't think that's really, that idea doesn't have much in the way of legs. The idea I want to push for you is this. It would be much better if we could have a technique that didn't require us to try to identify cases where there was no awareness. And that's just what the process dissociation approach promises. Process dissociation. Let me explain. Here's a stem, tab, and you can complete that stem, making a larger word, in two ways. You can convert tab to table or tab to taboo. That makes sense, doesn't it? Then we could have I could say cab as the stem, and you might say cable or caboo. Caboo a word? I think I've got a new caboo, a big caboo. Steve, you're not playing Scrabble. I don't have to argue with you. Maybe it's not a word. I don't know. Are there any other completions for cab? table, cabriolet. Is that a word? I'm not sure. Okay, anyway, we've got the idea. Now, if we were using stems and completions, there are actually two different games that we could play. I could give you an inclusion task. So I give you the stem tab, and then I'm going to flash a word at you. And if you see the word, you'd use that as completion for the tab. So I'm going to flash table at you, and if I do that, you should say table. And you get it wrong if you say taboo. Or I can give you an exclusion task. So now I give you the stem. You know what the stem is. You've got lots of time. But now I'm going to flash a word at you very quickly. And what you've got to do is exclude that. So if you see table, you mustn't use that, and instead you've got to say taboo or some other tab that begins with some other word that begins with tab. Make sense? Inclusion task, exclusion task. Why is this exciting? Maybe you like word games, but it's exciting for a scientific reason as well. The scientific reason is very simple. Think about what the effect of the perceptual awareness would be on performance and what the effect of a non-conscious perceptual process. So theoretically, what we should find is that any kind of perception, involving awareness or not, should facilitate performance when the task is inclusion, whereas, this is the really brilliant move, when the task is exclusion, you're not allowed to use the word that's presented to you very rapidly. Awareness will still facilitate, but the non-conscious perception should impair your performance. This is the key thing. Why is that? Well, if you're perceptually processing the stem, but you're not perceptually aware of it, then you can't use that, so Denby and Jacobi reason, you can't use that in order to exclude in your task explicitly the word. So the word is kind of influencing you, it's pulling you towards table, and your lack of awareness of it prevents you from using your perception of it as a reason for not completing the word with that stem. So this is brilliant. The first thing to note here is that the reason for thinking that non-conscious perception impairs performance in the exclusion task just is Dretske's idea about the operationalisation of perceptual awareness. We're actually relying on Dretske here, the scientists are, implicitly. The idea that lack of awareness is a matter of something not being available to the subject as a reason to exclude it. That's the first thing. The second thing here is that if you think about how this table is working, you've got kind of two different vectors. So it's going to be possible mathematically to separate out the effects of perceptual awareness on performance from the effects of non-conscious perception on performance by comparing performance on an inclusion task to performance on an exclusion task, as long as we can also systematically vary perceptual awareness. Make sense? Probably not. It's actually pretty difficult. It's just at the edge of what I can understand. Why I think a bunch of first-year philosophers right at the beginning of their course are going to engage with this, I don't know. I just can't resist it. I'm sorry about that. You really shouldn't be here. Nor should I. Anyway, let me carry on. So the key thing is, in order to separate out the effects of perceptual awareness and perception without awareness, to separate the two things out, it's not enough that we've got the tasks where those two things have different effects, so they pull in different directions. We also need to be able to vary whether or not, or the degree to which there is perceptual awareness. And to that end, we can use a method which involves dividing attention. So what happens is this. When there's no divided attention, it's just the word that's flashed up. It's very likely that you'll be aware of the word. When there's divided attention, the word is flashed up, flanked by two numbers. And your task is always to add up the numbers. So in this case, you'd have to add up the numbers, and you're going to say, I guess, 60. That would be the answer. And you've always got to do that. Now, because this appears quite briefly, and you have to do the number task, it's fairly unlikely that you're going to perceive the table, the word table. So it makes it less likely that there will be perceptual awareness in this case. Now, importantly, the process dissociation method doesn't require us to take a view on whether there is or isn't perceptual awareness in the divided attention. It doesn't require us to do that. It just requires us to accept that by dividing attention, we can change the probability that there is perceptual awareness. As long as you accept that, cases of divided attention, it's likely that perceptual awareness will be damped down and the response will be dominated or more strongly dominated by non-conscious processes. We can then use that to estimate the effect of the two processes on your response. So I'm going to say this again, it's super important. Nobody is saying that in the divided attention there is no perceptual awareness. That's not the idea at all. Surely there is often perceptual awareness. The point is just this, that your response always will be a function of your perceptual awareness and your unaware perception, but the relative roles of those two things will be different. When attention is divided, perceptual awareness will play less of a role than when attention is not divided. All we need, very simple assumption. So the key finding then from the Denby and Jacobi paper is that dividing attention impairs perceptual awareness without affecting non-conscious perception. Dividing attention impairs perceptual awareness without affecting non-conscious perception. That allows us to conclude, of course, that there is perception without awareness. Not in the sense that we can get a pure case, that we can have perception, a case where there is perception but there's no awareness, but rather in the sense that we can dissociate the two processes, we can separate the two processes. Brilliant, isn't it? Brilliant. I love this stuff. Now, I think it's important when we look at some research also to consider objections to it. And the Denby and Jacobi is kind of a landmark study, and I'm not aware of any many objections to it, but there is one from Sandberg and colleagues that I thought I should share with you. So what Sandberg and colleagues did was something quite similar. They're targeting a range of studies, and so they used the divided attention paradigm, but they also gave the subjects a questionnaire, and they asked them, to what extent were you aware of the word presented? They used something called the perceptual awareness scale, where the responses could be, I had no experience whatsoever, I had a kind of a weak glimpse, an almost clear experience, or a very clear experience. And what they found was that when I fail in the exclusion task, I do so almost as often when I report having no experience as I do when I report having a vague experience or a weak glimpse. So if I'm on 1 or 2 on the perceptual awareness scale, I'm as likely to fail. Now, Sandberg and colleagues take this to be an objection to the claim that this provides evidence that perceptual awareness and perception without awareness can be dissociated. But I think they're wrong for 2 reasons. One reason is that the whole point of the process dissociation approach is to get us away from people's reports about their own state of awareness. It's precisely because we don't trust those that we try to operationalise perceptual awareness in effect in the way that Dretske proposed. So it's not really an objection to that to say, look, your results just don't line up with what we find when we ask people about their perceptual awareness. No problem. So that's the first objection to the objection from Sandberg and colleagues. The second objection is this. When we're thinking about perceptual awareness, we're not thinking about kind of perceptual awareness of a shape or perceptual awareness that there was something between the numbers. We're thinking about perceptual awareness of the particular word, for example, table. But the perceptual awareness scale doesn't seem to be measuring that. So even if you reject my first objection to the objection, you might go for my second objection, which is that suppose we take this absolutely seriously, we take this absolutely at face value, we suppose there's no problem at all about subjects' own reports of awareness. The subjects in Sandberg and colleagues' study are not telling us that they were somehow aware of the word. They may have been aware that there was something between the two things, but not what it was. They were telling us that they had a weak glimpse of something. So also on this basis, I think we can reject their objection. They haven't shown that somehow the dividing attention paradigm is affecting performance on the exclusion task by a process other than partially impairing perceptual awareness. They haven't done that. The third thing, of course, is that actually it doesn't matter. The methodology of the process dissociation task isn't to eliminate perceptual awareness. I was stressing this before because, of course, I knew the Sandberg and colleagues' objection was coming. But it's there in Denby and Jacobi. It's there in Denby and Jacobi if you read that carefully as well. A couple of decades before Sandberg and colleagues were writing. Denby and Jacobi are very careful to suggest, for theoretical reasons, that their approach doesn't depend on the idea that the divided attention paradigm eliminates perceptual awareness. No, it doesn't. What it depends on is just the idea that it reduces the influence. We then use a mathematical theory. I haven't shared that with you, but they use a mathematical theory. It's a very simple one. It's explained in their paper. They use a mathematical theory to extract the force due to the perceptual awareness and the force due to the perception without awareness. They're separating those two things by looking beneath the surface phenomena. Okay, so I'm being clear here, I think. There is an objection to these findings, but I don't think it's a good objection. In fact, I think there are 3 objections to the objection, all of them quite good. So my own view here is that Denby and Jacobi are right. There can be perception without awareness. Now, I think this helps us with David's point, because David was concerned with the idea that in order to do experiments, we seem to need unconscious participants. That's going to create all kinds of practical problems. If we follow the process dissociation approach, that doesn't seem either necessary or any more even desirable. I think that's a brilliant discovery. The other thing that motivated me was the discrepancy between very attractive theory on Dretske's part, which I feel there's some mileage to, but the problem that Dretske claims that his account of how perceptual awareness is operationalised comes from scientific reports, when in fact it seems like what the scientists are doing is not taking reasons for actions, but just using the subject's reports, albeit in very subtle and careful ways. So I was suggesting Debner and Jacobi. Sorry, I've been pronouncing that wrong, haven't I? I've been saying Denver, but it's Debner and Jacobi. The reason I think this is so brilliant is because they are implicitly using exactly Dretske's criterion. It's only when you have perceptual awareness that it's only when you have perceptual awareness that information about the word you're supposed to exclude is as a reason for excluding. Otherwise, you just get this kind of associative effect. Marvellous. So now, you can say that Dretske's brilliant theory is one that does actually align with how scientists are studying unconscious perception. And that was Dretske's pitch. Look at what the scientists are doing when they're discovering perception without awareness, extract operational criteria from that, and from there get to the function of perceptual awareness. Done.